Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Buckles, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. I am the Chief Data Officer at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and it's my privilege to host today's session of the ACS user conference titled Housing Analysis Using ACS Data. A couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have questions of the presenter, can you please submit them in the Q&A feature on the conference website? There's both a chat and a Q&A feature. If you could use the Q&A feature, I would greatly appreciate that. And we are going to save all the questions until the final presentation is over. So we'll answer all questions at the end. So we got a great lineup today. We're going to start it off with Ethan Magnuson, who's going to present a presentation entitled The Eviction Crisis in South Carolina. We'll follow that up with Matt Schroeder in a presentation entitled How Accurate is ACS Data on Rental Housing? And then finally, Jean Sao with a presentation titled An Environmental Justice Analysis of Job and Housing Imbalance in the Southern California region. So with that, I will turn it over to Ethan Magnuson to get us going.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Myself and Dr. Grady have been working for the past year on an analysis of evictions in our home state of South Carolina. We work for the South Carolina Housing Finance Authority. And so when we learned that South Carolina actually has the highest eviction rate or eviction filing rate of any state in the nation, we were very concerned. As you can see here, this is a map of the eviction data that was compiled by Princeton Eviction Lab over the last couple of years for 2016. And
Ethan, we could only, I don't think you've shared your screen with us yet.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, so here you go. Here you can see a map of eviction filings nationwide. And South Carolina actually has the highest eviction rate of anywhere in the nation. And so what our study was looking into is how we can maybe get a better sense for the local variation within South Carolina and perhaps make some progress towards explaining why it has such a high eviction rate overall. So we got our data from our local court administration, who provided us with eviction cases from 2015 through 2020. And here for this study, we looked at evictions in 2019 and specifically eviction filings, since because of the nature of eviction data from South Carolina, it is difficult to determine whether an eviction actually ended in a set out. And so filings are the most accurate figure we can look for. So what you're looking at now is a hotspot map for the entire state, which shows where evictions are clustered or where they are dispersed. And very quickly, you can see how there are some strong patterns here. Almost the entire coast is a cold spot, meaning there are fewer evictions than we would expect given the number of renting households there. Several of the major in the center of the state, it almost forms a ring. But there's also a concentration in North Charleston and south of Greenville. There are also several smaller cities in South Carolina, like Florence, Spartanburg, Rock Hill, where evictions form a hotspot as well. And while this confirms what had been found by the Princeton Eviction Lab and journalists who have been reporting on the eviction crisis in South Carolina, it's not clear what a single overarching explanation would be for this sort of eviction pattern. And this is where ACS data really came in useful. We were able to use ACS variables to operationalize several of the different factor clusters which previous researchers have found contribute to eviction filings. So for example, housing characteristics, things like median rent, and whether a property has any habitability issues, population characteristics like the number of renters in an area, or their race or their income. And landlord characteristics, things like how many properties a landlord owns, and legal environment. These are things like the eviction filing fee. Now, in our study, we focused on the first three because while legal environment is very important, in South Carolina, we have a unified court system where most of the court policies are set on a statewide basis. And without detailed documentation of variation in local courts, we decided that it would be best to focus on the other characteristics until at a future date, we hope to know more about the legal environment at the local level in South Carolina. And so, as you can see here, these are all the variables that we looked at. The ones in black came from the American Community Survey. The ones in red either came from CHAS or were landlord characteristics, where we used the eviction data itself to determine the percent of evictions that were filed by different categories of landlord. For example, by corporate property managers or by individuals filing under their own name, or properties owned by in the LIHTC program, or public housing authorities. Now, as you can obviously tell, a lot of these variables are measuring similar or the same thing. And so what we did during our first level of analysis, which was a negative binomial regression, is we eliminated the variables that were multicollinear. And basically what that means, for those of you who aren't familiar, multicollinearity is where one of your independent variables can be predicted by some of the others. And once we had eliminated all the multicollinear variables, what you see now are the variables that we included in our final negative binomial regression model. And what negative binomial regression is it's a way of fitting for a regression equation. It's similar, but not the same as ordinary least squares, which is what most of you are probably familiar with. Unlike ordinary least squares, it does not create a R squared as the main measure of the model's effectiveness. Instead, we get a measure of the deviance explained by the model, which is similar to an R squared, but not quite the same. So as you can see here, using these ACS and data generated variables, we can explain over 78% of the deviance in the base model, which is very powerful and shows that using neighborhood characteristics like this can really give you a good sense of where evictions are going to take place, at least within South Carolina. However, as you can also tell, if you look at the significance column, there were not all of the variables that were found to be significant in previous studies were able to be replicated as such here. Most notably, I would point your attention to the percentage of the population that was Black, which has been shown to be one of the strongest correlates of eviction in previous studies. But in our research, we did not show, once we controlled for all of these other variables, a significant correlation there. Now, that could be for a lot of reasons, which you can talk about later, but it is interesting to note that a similar thing was found with a negative binomial model when applied to the state of Michigan. So the next part of our study was the core of what we were trying to do, which is look at how we could model evictions using a geographically weighted form of regression known as GWR. And what GWR allows us to do is to basically model many different studies all at once. And this has been widely used in other bits of parts of housing research, but it has not yet been applied to evictions. So one of the problems with measuring evictions, for example, is that housing markets can be varied in size, that can change over time, and it's not always obvious if you're looking at a state like South Carolina how big your study area should be. You want to be able to capture the full range of eviction variation, but with no prior knowledge, it can be difficult to do so. But what GWR does is it allows us to get around that by creating a unique regression equation for each census tract. So the way that this works is, rather than creating a single universal regression equation for each census tract, GWR looks at the census tracts around it and fits a regression model based on those census tracts, and then applies it to the census tract in question to find out how effective the regression model is. And the benefit of this is you can, by adjusting the number of neighbors or the size of the area being considered when fitting each regression equation, you can model many different sizes of housing market, many different shapes of housing market in a single study fairly easily. And as you might imagine, this improves the accuracy quite a lot, because it allows for variables that have a certain one effect in one housing market, but a different effect in another, to be accounted for in a single model or in a single global geographically weighted regression model. As you can see here, the deviance explained by the local model, or the spatial model as we call it, is over 92%, which is a significant increase on the deviance explained by the non-spatial model. Now, the AICC value for the geographically weighted regression model was a bit higher than the non-spatial model, which means that we haven't quite achieved an efficient way of incorporating geographically weighted regression into the way that we model eviction. But it is our belief that with slightly different parameters and a little bit of tweaking, we could get it to the point where geographically weighted regression is a more efficient way of predicting eviction variation on the local level. And as you can see in the map on the top there, the hotspots, which I had shown you in the first map, are able to be almost completely explained by the geographically weighted regression model. In other words, there are no significant spatial variables that were left unaccounted for in the geographically weighted regression model that we used. But the most interesting thing that geographically weighted regression gives us is, because it is creating all of these different regression equations, each with different coefficients for each of the variables, we can actually map what these coefficients are, and we can see how they vary over space. And this allows us to understand how eviction interacts with local housing markets in different ways in different areas. For example, as you can see on these maps of a select few of the variables that we used, there are some clearly defined housing markets within the state of South Carolina, which are very different from their surroundings. For example, in the second map there of median rent, you can see how in most of the state, areas with higher median rents have a lower number of eviction filings. But in Spartanburg County and the surroundings, it actually has a positive effect, which means that there's a different dynamic going on in that area of the state than elsewhere. Surprisingly, you can even see that total rental households, which we would assume to be highly correlated with evictions everywhere, is actually insignificant in the area at the bottom tip of South Carolina, Hilton Head or Beaufort County, which indicates that there is a very unique housing market dynamic taking place there as well. And this will allow researchers and policymakers to better understand the localized eviction crisis, which is something that's been increasingly emphasized by researchers, and develop policy solutions that are fine-tuned to the eviction crisis in each locality. So in conclusion, we can say that neighborhood characteristics can predict a significant portion of the local variation in eviction. And these neighborhood characteristics include a lot of ACS data, but importantly, I would also add the landlord characteristics are also very significant. Geographically weighted regression model is useful for understanding, we have shown through these coefficient rasters, can be useful for understanding the interaction between eviction and various local housing market dynamics. And finally, there is a lot more research that needs to be done on why we failed to find a relationship between Black neighborhoods and higher eviction filing counts in South Carolina, because we know through a lot of other studies that African Americans are more likely to be evicted. But the fact that once controlling for all those variables at the neighborhood level, there is not a significant relationship, should open the door to more research into why that might be and what might be causing this. So, and yeah, landlord characteristics are the single most important factor cluster for explaining eviction filing rates. As many other researchers have noted, the decision to file an eviction is, of course, the landlord's, and that means the type of landlord that you have has a very big impact on your likelihood of getting evicted. So thank you. I hope to be able to answer any of your questions later, and that's all I got now.
Excellent. Thank you, Ethan, for that great presentation. Up next is Matt Schroeder with a presentation entitled "How Accurate is ACS Data on Rental Housing?" Matt, take it away.
Sorry, thought I had unmuted. I'm hoping, Ethan, if you can hear me, can you just give a thumbs up? Great. Yeah, so great. I'm sorry, this really worked, I swear. So I'll be talking today about an alternative set of estimates for rental units that I developed for the Twin Cities region. And I do want to say that as I think about how these stack up against ACS data, the title, I feel kind of ambivalent about it. It feels like an unfair comparison in the sense that the ACS wasn't designed to like really hone in on a really precise picture of a single topic. It was designed to cover a wide array of characteristics across housing units and households and people. So my goal here today is really not to persuade you not to use ACS data, and it does not say that Ethan's great presentation before me should be subject to doubt. I'm really just trying to do two things, I guess. One is to demonstrate the development of an alternative set of estimates for rental units, and then second, to at least quantify the differences between those and the ACS data so that we can interpret the ACS data accordingly. I think it's important to do this given the housing policy interest. In the Twin Cities, nearly half of our renters are cost burdened. That rate is pretty low among large metro areas, but still really high. We also have a growing number of multi-generational families who need larger units with more bedrooms, but don't always have the money to buy homes that would be larger. And then two, despite the pandemic, our rents in the Twin Cities have been holding, at least for the kind of older, more affordable units, pretty steady. And so as investors look to these areas or these units to renovate and then raise rents, it's another, I think, important thing to understand. Looking at what else has been done, I couldn't find that much. The studies that have compared administrative data to ACS data have focused mostly on the ownership market, and have found that ACS respondents tend to overstate the value of their home and how much they pay in property taxes, but rent is less subjective than that. Presumably you know exactly how much you're paying per month. And then a lot of that was spurred by the desire to see if ACS questionnaire items could be replaced by this data. So by matching administrative data to the master address file, it's possible to compare that, but my understanding is that there's a much lower match rate for rental units or multifamily units, which are more likely to be rentals. And then finally, even if we could look at the address level discrepancies ourselves, it's different from looking at the discrepancies for geographic units once those addresses are all rolled up to higher level geographic units. So I think it seems like an important thing to look at. So I want to do a few things today. One is to look at just the tenure breakdown of all housing units into ownership units versus rental units. Then to break the rental units into two components, one being the apartment market, the other being what some people call the shadow market. So these are single family homes, duplex, triplex, quadplex units, and condominiums that are rented instead of owned. And then finally, to break all those rental units apart into, with respect to a few different characteristics that, again, I think have interest to people in many ways. So these alternative estimates, I'll just say a bit about those first. These were developed using data from nearly all rental units, not including manufactured homes, not including other housing units that don't always show up in these sources, but as complete, I think, as was available readily. So for the shadow market, really drawing mostly on county parcel data, as well as data from Tracts, which is Zillow's extract that they make available to researchers. So that has a lot of data on building characteristics, tenure, years, the year the structure was built, the number of units that are in the building, but doesn't have information on rents, obviously. On the apartment side, there's CoStar, which is a private firm that models rents based on apartments.com listings, which it owns. And then also has lots of detail on the characteristics of units as well. But again, unless you want to do a huge amount of clicking around on the website, you can't get historical rents for every building. So that is where a locally specific resource comes in. Housing Link is a local nonprofit that focuses on housing affordability. It publishes a data set called the Rental Review, which includes rental listings going back to, I think, 2012. There's full data for. So this does not have many characteristics of buildings, but does have information on rents that is specific to each year and each number of bedrooms, as well as to shadow versus apartment markets. So even though, yeah, the kind of those main data sources that do cover collectively nearly all rental units don't have rent data, it's still possible to approximate them, which is why I want to say that these are really not any sort of benchmark, I guess. I'm not arguing that they're a benchmark against which to measure the accuracy of ACS data, but it is another, a more complete source, a source that's less subject to respondent error. Yeah, I think it's worth comparing them. And I'll just refer to those as the alternative estimates from here on out. I think this presentation was running a bit long, so I'm going to skip over exactly how the rents were estimated. Happy to talk more about that later if it'd be useful. I just wanted to say a little bit first about before getting into the comparisons of ACS and the alternative estimates, about the distinction between apartments and the shadow market, which is that even though analyses, or well, policy debates, I guess, around rentals tend to focus on apartment units, as well as preservation efforts, preservation of affordability. The shadow market is a pretty big component of the rental market. So region-wide in the Twin Cities region, I'm not sure you can see my mouse, but if you can, these two larger cities with the large blue bubbles in the middle are Minneapolis on the left and St. Paul on the right. So region-wide, again, a third of rental units are in the shadow market, and that is true as well for Minneapolis and St. Paul, not just the cities closer to the edge of the region that don't have many apartments. So again, I think important to incorporate that into analyses of rental units. Getting into the comparison then of these alternative estimates and the ACS estimates. All of these are based on the 2015 to 2019 period. Again, a small slice of what it could be given the trends since the beginning of the decade, but still I think informative. So looking first at the 2015 to 2019 ACS 5-year estimates, darker shades of purple here are higher shares of rental units, so lower homeownership rates, you could also think of it as. And these, so just organized by deciles. I know that as others have presented or will present on in this conference, there are, because of the sampling error around the ACS estimates, there's some uncertainty about exactly which decile each area falls into. But still, that said, I think useful to compare the deciles to the alternative estimates. So flipping back and forth between those, there's some differences, definitely not everything, but yeah, a fair amount of shifting around. So then to look more directly at the differences between those for each unit, lag there, sorry. Darker shades of blue here indicate areas where the alternative sets of estimates are higher than the ACS estimates would suggest. And deeper shades of orange are areas where the alternative estimates yield results that are lower than the ACS estimates. So again, a good deal of heterogeneity, both across cities on the left and across census tracts within cities on the right. Good to be able to see, but the question then becomes how to summarize all this into something that is, I guess, more useful and more actionable maybe to researchers. And so with the, just kind of assuming the counterfactual that people do have access to alternative estimates in their regions, to ask forward questions. If I did have the alternative estimates, would they tend to show higher or lower values than ACS estimates? And then second, by how much would those alternative estimates differ from ACS data? So both the direction and the degree of the divergence. Third, given that there are margins of error for ACS estimates that can be used to construct confidence intervals, would those confidence intervals encompass the alternative estimate as well? So using what we know about the sampling error to get a broader range of values that might encompass a more complete set of estimates. And then fourth, finally, just looking at how they covary. So if a given geography has a relatively high value of some characteristic in ACS data, could I also trust that that value in the alternative estimates would be relatively high? So moving through these in sequence, looking at the difference in percent rentals. So summarizing that map from 2 slides ago to just looking at the distribution in these categories of rental units for cities and townships on the left and census tracts on the right. So again, the distribution is shifted toward the more blue, the higher end. So typically the alternative estimates tend to be higher, show higher proportions of rental units than the ACS data do. Then the second question, by how much? So if I took any given geography, about by how much would it be off, higher or lower than the, how much would the alternative estimates and the ACS estimates diverge? And so it's looking, I mean, tough to say, I guess, for anyone's given for a given set of purposes, whether this is sufficient, but I mean, a third or more of units in both cities and townships and census tracts are within 2.5 percentage points of each other, the absolute estimates and alternative estimates and the ACS estimates. So, and then just looking at the median difference here, it's 3.2 percentage points for cities and townships, and then 3.6 percentage points for census tracts. So yeah, not too far off. And then third, using what we know about the sampling error in the ACS, say that we have an alternative estimate of 20% rentals and an ACS estimate of 15%. So difference of 5 percentage points. Let's also say that the ACS confidence interval runs from 11% to 19%. So that confidence interval does not contain the alternative estimate. We could also imagine a different census tract with the same estimate of 15%, but more, excuse me, more sampling error, less reliability. And that's, so this would contain the alternative estimate. Ideally, the confidence intervals containing the alternative estimates obviously would be better to get those differences closer together. But rather than just having the interval itself widen, but still something we can do. So across cities and townships and census tracts, in half of the cities and townships, the majority of confidence intervals do contain the alternative estimates. And then for census tracts, that's almost 2/3. So using what we know about sampling error, at least for percent of rentals, it looks pretty decent. And then finally, looking at how they covary just with the simple Pearson correlation, it's a pretty strong relationship. So that if you are looking at an ACS geography where the estimate is relatively high, it's also likely to be relatively high in the alternative estimates. So then getting into more characteristics of rental units rather than just whether they're ownership or rental. It's possible to look at this in a lot of different ways, looking at the full distribution of all these categories, choosing different cut points, but to simplify how I talk about this, I'm just going to choose 4 different characteristics that I think are relevant to people who are looking at housing. One, for your structure built, the share of units built before 1950 to approximate homes that are likely, more likely, I guess, than homes built later to have lead-based paint in them. For units in structure, just using percent single-family detached as a way of looking at if you wanted to do some policy intervention that was going to try to shift single-family rentals towards single-family ownerships that might be more affordable. This might be one way to look at that. Third, looking at the share of units with 3 or more bedrooms that might be able to accommodate larger families. And then finally, the median contract rent. And I will say too that one shortcoming, I think, of the alternative estimates is that because they don't include data on utility costs, it's really only contract rent that we can look at, not gross rent. So it doesn't cover all of the housing costs that renters would incur. Whenever this decides to move, moving down these in sequence, we've already seen that the alternative estimates tend to show higher shares of rental units than the ACS estimates. It also shows relatively newer rental units, so lower shares of rental units built before 1950, more rental units that are single family detached, higher shares of rental units with more than 3 bedrooms, and then finally higher contract rents. And then looking at the degree of that divergence, I said before that it was relatively low, at least for the tenure breakdown, but not as much for these other characteristics of rental units. So 11 percentage points for your structure built, for example, the share of units built before 1950. And then looking at rents in particular, more than a $200 discrepancy for the median city or township. So again, depending on what specifically you're looking at, the alternative estimates might be fairly far apart. And again, that same conclusion holds for the confidence intervals. I will say that the greater variability of rental units with 3 or more bedrooms has more of those confidence intervals encompassing the alternative estimate, but for median contract rent in particular, only about a quarter of them do. And then finally, again, the Pearson correlation for median rents between the alternative and ACS estimates is substantially lower than for the other characteristics, but still positive, still not weak. So again, I don't think it's, again, not saying that the ACS is not to be trusted. And then looking at census tracts, I'll just mention that the same general patterns occur here, but you may notice that comparing cities and townships to census tracts, the degree of divergence in column 2 and the Pearson correlations. So the divergence tends to be lower for census tracts, the correlations tend to be higher. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, except to say that it's consistent with one other study that I've seen, and it's possible that is consistent in the sense that smaller units of geography yield smaller divergences than larger units do. It's possible that there's more homogeneity of the housing stock within tracts, and so it kind of leaves less room for the compositional differences in the housing stock that might creep into city level estimates. But again, I welcome ideas on what else might be behind that. And then finally, to wrap up, the main point is it is possible to construct alternative estimates for rental units, but I can't say that it's a quick or simple thing, but again, happy to talk more. And then second, those alternative estimates do, again, largely agree with ACS estimates on the tenure breakdown, but in the characteristics of rental units, not so much, especially the share of units built before 1950 and median contract rents. One thing I wasn't able to do for this was that I think might go farther towards providing that actionable data would be to look at the potential correlates of the alternative and ACS estimates alignments. I did see that the number of rental units in a tract, the housing stock diversity in a tract was pretty much unrelated to the divergence of these two sets of estimates. But being able to understand what those are could help researchers better understand if they're looking at any given geographic area, depending on the characteristics of that area, whether, again, that alternative set of estimates, where that might be likely to fall. With that, I will wrap up. But yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to discussion and questions.
All right, thank you, Matt, for that great presentation. Next up is Jean Sao with a presentation entitled An Environmental Justice Analysis of Job and Housing Imbalance in Southern California Region. Jean, you're up, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for joining this session. I'm Jung Seo, a regional planner, specialist at SCAG, Southern California Association of Government. So in this presentation, I'd like to share about SCAG's environmental justice analysis of job and housing imbalance or mismatch in Southern California region. And my co-author is Tom Bo. So let me just briefly introduce about SCAG. SCAG is a nation's largest NPO. We are representing 6 counties in Southern California and 191 cities. So those 6 counties include the counties of Imperial, Los Angeles, and Orange, and Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura. And as of the year 2020, there are about 90 million people in our region, and the gross regional product is about 1,352 billion, which put the SCAG region the 15th largest economy in the world. And as an NPO and also as a council of government, SCAG also conduct various plan development and policy analysis, including the regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy, and federal transportation improvement program, and regional housing need assessment. And as an NPO, SCAG is responsible for developing a regional transportation plan every 4 years. The RTP, it is a long-range visioning plan, and it contains regional transportation strategies and investment to reduce traffic congestion, to improve the network efficiency, and to enhance mobility choices. And pursuant to California SB 375, NPO is also responsible to develop sustainable community strategies to integrate transportation, land use, housing, and climate policy at the regional level to reduce greenhouse gas emission. And in September 2020, SCAG has adopted ConnectSoCal, the 2020 RTP ACS. So SCAG has been integrated the principle of Title VI into its RTP to address the environmental justice. So in preparation for the RTP ACS development, SCAG conducted the EJ analysis to assess the impact of RTP programs and projects on minority and low-income populations for those EJ populations. And also SCAG conducted a comprehensive EJ community outreach so that those communities can have opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. So in the practice of regional transportation planning process, this topic, jobs and housing imbalance or mismatch, it is considered one of the key contributors to long distance commuting and traffic congestion and air pollution. And in addition, the spatial or geographic mismatch between where people work and live, it is considered as an impediment to environmental justice and also social equity, given that the EJ populations tend to be more sensitive to job accessibility due to housing cost and also commuting cost. So SCAC conducted EJ analysis of jobs housing imbalance to better understand the spatial and also temporal dynamics of jobs housing mismatch in our region. And also we did it, we wanted to also look at more in a geographically detailed way. So the research question of this study is whether there are significant differences in commuting distance between different income level, also between different geographic areas, such as coastal counties, also inland counties. And also you want to look at the differences between temporal period as well. So in this study, we compared the median wages for inter-county workers and intra-county workers. And also we compared the median commute distance and also jobs to worker ratio by wage. And in addition, we also looked at the jobs housing ratio and also low wage job housing fit. So in this study, we used the following three major data sets. First, census ACS 5-year estimate, and also LEHD origin destination employment statistics data, the loads data, and also ACS 5 years pumps data. So first, we examined the median wages for inter-county and also intra-county commuters using the 2013-2017 ACS 5-year pumps data. So the table in this slide, it shows the median wages for inter-county and intra-county commuters for 6 counties in the SCAC region plus San Diego County. So the results indicate the most inter-county commuters command much higher wage than those commuters who work and live in the same county, which is shown in the gray color in this table. So for example, the median wages for the workers who work and live in Riverside County is about $25,500. But on the other hand, the median wage for the Riverside County workers who commute to other counties are higher than that. And also we examine the historical trend in median commute distance by wage using the census LHD, the loads data file for the years 2002 and 2012 and 2016. So we aggregated the loads block level data to the census tract level to estimate the median commute distance between the origin and destination tracts by wage in each county in the SCAC region. So the table in this slide, it shows the median commute distance by wage for counties, for the 6 counties in the SCAC region for the years 2002 and 2012 and 2016. And as expected, the higher wage workers tend to commute longer distance than the lower wage workers. And the commute distance of workers in inland counties like Imperial County, Riverside County, and San Bernardino County, their commute distance has grown more rapidly than in the coastal counties. And these two maps, it shows the median county distance by wage, by census tract for all jobs and also for low wage jobs in the SCAC region. So comparing those two maps, we see more blue colors in the right side map, which indicate the low wage workers, they tend to commute a shorter distance. And in both maps, we can also see more red and orange colors in inland counties than in coastal counties, which indicate that the commute distance of workers in inland counties are longer than those in coastal counties. We also examine the job housing ratio, and in addition to the traditional measure of jobs housing balance, but before that which kind of similar to the jobs housing ratio, but we also look at using the LEHD loaded data. We also look at the jobs to worker ratio. So it kind of shows whether jobs or workers are relatively balanced at the county level and at the neighborhood level by wage. So the table that you can see in this slide, it shows the job to worker ratio by wage for counties in the SCAG region for the year 2016. So we estimated the total jobs and workers for each census tract by using the median commute distance for all jobs of each county in 2016. So it is observed that the inland counties shows a lower job to worker ratio as compared to the coastal counties. And we also prepared the maps for those two categories. So these two maps shows the jobs to worker ratio for all jobs and also low wage jobs in the SCAG region. So comparing the previous, the median commute distance analysis and also this job to worker ratio between coastal counties and also inland counties, the counties with the lower job to worker ratio would generate more long distance commuters. And it indicates the need for more job growth in inland counties, while the coastal counties need more housing growth. Oops, sorry, yeah. So the next, we also examine the job housing ratio. So in addition to traditional measure of job housing ratio, we thought it is also important to examine the job housing fit between available housing type and also the income level of residents. So as part of the job housing imbalance analysis, we conducted the job housing fit analysis. So we applied job housing fit methodology developed by UC Davis Center for Regional Change, and we conducted the low-wage job housing fit analysis at the neighborhood level, in other words, census tract level, as well as city level. So for the low-wage job housing fit analysis, we examined the ratio between total job numbers of low-wage job, total number of low-wage jobs, and also the total number of affordable rental units. So for this analysis, job data was obtained from the census LEHD load data, and also housing data was obtained from the census ACS 5-year estimate. And the table on this slide shows job housing ratio and low-wage job housing fit in the SCAG region for the year 2010 and 2016. And as shown, I don't know if you guys can see the numbers clearly, but as shown in the table, the ratio of job to housing increased between 2010 and 16. Oh, sorry. But on the other hand, low-wage job housing fit ratio actually decreased during the same period. And also coastal counties have a substantial concentration of low-wage jobs, but lack of adequate number of affordable rental units. But on the other hand, the inland counties, they have substantial concentration of affordable rental unit relative to the number of low-wage jobs. So we prepared the two maps. So this map shows the ratio of job to housing unit, and also the other map shows the ratio of low-wage jobs to affordable rental unit at the census tract level. So these maps shows there are more neighborhood in coastal counties, especially Orange County and Ventura counties, that have relatively higher concentration of low-wage jobs, but lack of adequate number of affordable rental units. But on the other hand, there are more neighborhood in inland counties and also central Los Angeles area, at the blue area that you can see in the right side map. They have relatively higher concentration of affordable housing unit relative to the low-wage jobs. So as a summary of the analysis result, this is a summary of some highlights from our study. So higher wage workers, they tend to commute a longer distance than lower wage workers. And we also observed the commute distance of workers in inland counties has grown more rapidly than coastal counties. And also we observed the inland counties show a lower job to worker ratio than coastal counties, which indicate there are more long distance commuters in inland counties. And also coastal counties have substantial concentration of low wage jobs, but lack an adequate number of affordable rental units. On the other hand, the inland counties have a substantial concentration of affordable rental units relative to the number of the low wage jobs. And also based on SCAG's growth forecasting, it is expected that the job housing balance in the SCAG region may be improved due to the faster growth of employment over population in the inland counties through the year 2045. And hopefully the improvement in job housing balance may result in a reduction of the transportation congestion and related air quality problems. And that's it for my presentation. And thanks again for joining this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I want to invite anybody who has a question to go ahead and submit those on the live Q&A functionality within the conference website. Right now, we actually don't have anybody who's submitted a question yet, so I am going to assert moderator's privilege and go ahead and ask the presenters a few questions here. So Ethan, if you could join us, I have a question for you. So in the administrative data on evictions that you guys are getting in South Carolina, we'd be just generally more interested in hearing your thoughts on where that, exactly where that data is coming from. And if you are familiar with it, do you think it's picking up any informal evictions or evictions that were started but never carried out? Or is it just strictly picking up formal evictions that were carried out?
Yeah, so we got our data from the South Carolina Judicial Branch, which collected the data from the 319 or 17 magistrates courts that handle evictions throughout South Carolina. And we spent a long time processing this data and trying to get it to the highest level of accuracy that we could. So the data that we were given contains all eviction cases that were started. So this includes those that were settled in favor of the defendant, those that were dropped, those that led to an eviction, all of the ones that ended up in the court. So it doesn't include any informal evictions. So your landlord just sends you a letter saying, hey, I'm going to evict you unless you move out. Something like that would not be included. It wouldn't include people being forced out because of rising rents or anything of that nature, but anything that's included in the courts would be. And so at first, our goal was to look at just evictions that actually led to a set out. That is like the sheriff coming and removing a tenant, because that tends to be what people imagine when they think of evictions. But the more we looked at our data and also studied the issue more broadly, the more we realized that that was neither possible with our data nor necessarily the best way to conceptualize the problem of eviction. And the first point, the court data doesn't record whether or not a sheriff was ever called. So we know through the reports of local experts and lawyers that in some cases, a landlord will actually go as far as to get a writ of ejectment, which is what allows the landlord to call the sheriff, but never actually call the sheriff and simply use it as a tool to try to get rent from the tenant. They might even then go the next month if the tenant still hasn't paid and go through the whole court process again, still with a valid writ of ejectment in hand, because the point of the court process for them is not to receive the writ of ejectment. Exactly, it's to arm twist the tenant. And so we can't necessarily say that writ of ejectments are equivalent to set outs. And for that reason, based on data, we couldn't actually measure whether an eviction had happened or a set out had happened. We could only measure eviction filings. The other issue is that it may not be necessarily even desirable to focus so narrowly on that specific aspect of the problem. Because as you mentioned, there's informal evictions. And so by using eviction filings, we tried to capture a more general view of the displacement going on. I hope that clarifies some of the questions.
Yeah. So do you think in your analysis then you're I guess anecdotally one of the things I've learned about evictions is that people with different characteristics may be what's the right word here, differently swayed by somebody showing up, by a landlord showing up with a piece of paper. Somebody may not be intimidated by that. Others may be, kind of depending upon their level of legal sophistication, for lack of a better word. So
yeah, or like legal
analysis...
self-efficacy. Like, yeah. This is definitely true. And I've heard this statistic mentioned, but I haven't got any backup for it, so don't quote me, but I've heard that 30% of renters, when they receive that letter that says, you know, you're being summoned to a court for missing rent, they'll just leave. They won't fight it. They won't try to negotiate with the landlord. They'll just leave. And yeah, that might have something to do with certain demographic characteristics. And that might mean, because there's a big problem of serial eviction in South Carolina, as I mentioned, landlords filing over and over on the same tenant, which would inflate the numbers for certain demographics who might be more likely to stay and try to fight it out. This might have an influence on our outcomes as well. There's a lot of things that we weren't able to consider given the limitations of our data, but in the future, we hope to get defendant names with this data as well, which would allow us to do things like estimate what the racial identity of some of the tenants are, what their gender is, that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Let's see here, Matt. I think we have a question for you from the audience. How did you determine the agreement between the alternative sources and the ACS? Was it either all together or individually?
So I made estimates for each census tract and then for each city and township. And then for that, kind of those overall measures of divergence, deviation, whatever you want to call it, those were just looking at the distributions of those divergences and looking at the, in some cases, the median, looking at as well as the, like for each city and township, whether the its ACS confidence interval for median gross rent, for example, median contract rent, encompassed the alternative estimate and so on. So they started as estimates for individual geographic units that then I aggregated to the region, but not weighting by the number of rental units. So it doesn't roll up to just what the regional average would be. So just imagining that anyone was looking at data for one geographic area, regardless of how many rental units are in it, what might they expect a divergence to be?
Another question. So how did I'm familiar with the term shadow in the economic context. How did you come up with that term for describing what I think most commonly described as just the single family housing market? Like why did you pick the term shadow to apply to that?
That is it's a term that I've seen used in reports for at least, I think maybe just in Minnesota, but it's a term that Housing Link, that local nonprofit I mentioned, uses as well. The idea is to encompass all units that aren't really part of the apartment market. So a lot of those are single family homes, but others are duplex, triplex, or quadplex units that are often rented, but that don't tend to show up in I guess the sort of fuller data that people tend to have in apartments.
Yeah, that is, I know from my travels in the housing data world that is not necessarily a very well understood part of the rental housing market. Sometimes they tend to be owned as single families, but you know, they're individually titled or individually deeded housing units, but they're part of the rental housing market. So that can make them a little difficult to pick up in alternative estimates.
Yeah, and then I should say that, sorry, I lost my train of thought, that it might be worth choosing a different term given the overlap that you mentioned between other uses of the term.
Another question for you, Matt. Do your alternative measures include more informal rental agreements, or is it limited to units that are formally advertised?
They would be limited to units that are formally advertised. That's a really great point. As I mentioned, the rental review listings from our local nonprofit Housing Link are derived from listings. CoStar, I think I mentioned they do, their rents are modeled, but the model is based on data from listings from apartments.com, which I think I mentioned they own, and other sources. And so it's that, yeah, that is unlikely really to encompass informal agreements as well. So yeah, if anyone has any idea on what the prevalence of those informal agreements is, and I guess specifically how that might vary across different kinds of geographic areas, yeah, it would be really great to hear.
Closely related to that, is there a data source perhaps available from local units of government that would give you a sense of whether or not a housing unit, the owner of a housing unit also has a rental license? I don't know if rentals are licensed in your neck of the woods or not.
Yeah, and that gets, I'm glad that question came up. It does get at another limitation of the alternative estimates, which is that the ownership, as people typically do, had to be proxied for by whether it had a homestead exemption in the property tax context. Yeah, I mean, we don't know whether whether any given unit has a homestead exemption just because the owner wanted to claim it but doesn't actually live there, or yeah, so we don't really know how accurate that is. So we have looked into rental licensing data. That does vary a lot over our we have somewhere around 180 units of local government. I think about 120, 140 of those are cities. And I know there's a lot of variation across those cities in whether they do license rentals. It's something we've started collecting data on, that is whether or not they do have a rental licensing program. But from my conversations with city staff, because it was gathered for entirely different purposes, its usefulness for housing analyses may be a little iffy, but and also I guess there are logistical difficulties there too, given that that data tends to exist in databases that are maintained by people whose goal is to track these things and not be able to generate data for research purposes. But yeah, definitely something to keep thinking about as as new data systems become available, and potentially could make that easier.
One last question for you. Any plans to do a similar analysis based on the 2020 decennial data once it's made available, particularly the housing unit data? There's there's at least 4 different federal sources for shares of renters or owners: the American Community Survey, the decennial, American Housing Survey, the current population survey. And at no point in time do any of them agree with each other. But I think from my perspective, I think the decennial probably provides the best measure because of the level of effort put into getting that kind of a response back. So any plans to measure your alternative estimates against estimates from the decennial?
Yeah, absolutely. This data development project was really just one effort towards developing parcel-based estimates of the sort that Kate Ness talked about in a previous session. And so being able to look at that against the 2020 census data, both to, I guess it's given the questions that people have around what the 2020 census data will look like. I don't know whether that the differences will say more about the census or the parcel data on which the alternative estimates would be based. But since at least since my understanding, I think, is that the block level counts of housing units will be held invariant and won't be subject to differential privacy, that should be at least pretty accurate, and that from there, it'll be possible to look at the accuracy, at least with respect to the tenure breakdown. The others would, I guess for local data, the ACS is really the only game in town, unless people have access to these other sources, which are not always easy to get.
Yep. Good. Okay, I've got a couple questions for June. Jean, have you looked at whether any of the imbalances in jobs in housing in terms of racial and ethnic differences, and if so, do you think that COVID may have changed some of the observed patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we didn't look at the racial or ethnicity difference for this job housing imbalance analysis, but we looked at those race and ethnicity difference in our EJ, entire EJ analysis. And what we observed is those minority and low income, they pretty have the similar patterns, but even among the minority, there are Asian and Black and Latino. So there's also different patterns for different topics. So I think that's a great question. It would be also interesting for us to examine this kind of topic based on the race and ethnicity difference, and see how it is different from the income level as well. And also for the second question, COVID, I think I'm also interested in see the result when we prepare the next RTP EJ analysis. What would the result look like? How the COVID has changed all these kind of job housing and commuting patterns. But one thing I observed during this COVID pandemic, lot of transit agencies, they reduced the service frequency. So that really hardly impacted the low-income people, low-income population who has limited to the job accessibility, and then they are also relying on the transit services, and many of them are actually essential workers. So during this pandemic, this kind of job housing imbalance, I think that had great impact on those kind of population as well. And after this, during this pandemic, people experience the teleworking, work from home, and then they are moving to suburban and then more teleworking. I guess more teleworking may reduce the traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emission, but at the same time, if people are moving the outside, I don't have answers, but yeah, I'm also interested to see the result of all this, pandemic and then new normal. But that was really great question, and also that's also our research question for the next regional planning process. Thank you.
Another question, you kind of touched on this in your prior answer. Are your commute distances measured in minutes or miles? And the questioner says, we find in Denver that low-income workers can have high commute times due to relying on transit.
Yeah, our median commute distance, we used the Euclidean distance. So what we did was we used the sensor track centroid, origin and destination centroid, and then we used the Euclidean distance, a straight line between those two, origin and destination centroid. So those median commute distance may be shorter than the real commute distance because we use the Euclidean distance.
Okay. And then another question I read recently that I think, if I recall correctly, Los Angeles County has now legalized accessory dwelling units. I don't know if how much those have taken hold, and I don't know, if the inland counties have also done that. Any thoughts on that, and when would you expect to see that have any real impact on the jobs housing ratio?
That's a great question and very important question. And as a council of government, we adopted the RHNA, the Regional Housing Assessment, the allocation plan for our 197 local jurisdictions. And so all those local jurisdictions in the California and also SCAG region, of course, they need to update their housing element by this October. And one of the key factor for this round, the housing element is ADU, accessory dwelling unit. So that so each local jurisdiction, they need to do the site inventory, and then where on which site those kind of additional housing unit can be added. So they need to amend the zoning ordinance, and also they need to consider a lot of factors, but one of the key factors is ADU. And also SCAG, as a regional agency, we also conducted the regional ADU analysis. So we looked at the parcel-based land use data and also building information. So we combined all those comprehensive information. We kind of develop a couple of different kind of scenario for the ADU development. So yeah, like you mentioned, this ADU topic will be playing a key role for the next housing supply purpose especially in this Southern California region.
So related to that, do you, an outstanding question for me on ADUs has always been, how well would ADUs match up with the kinds of households that are most impacted by housing shortages? Any thoughts on that, and based on any of the work that you've done?
I'm not expert on this ADU topic, but each local jurisdiction has its own, they adopt their own ADU regulations, if I understand correctly. So I think when it comes to ADU, I think how much it will help actually the low income or minority household or seniors or young people, young generation. I think it depends on how the local jurisdictions adopt their ADU regulations. Of course, the state has state level guidance, but as far as I understand, each local jurisdiction adopt its own ADU regulations. So in my opinion, although I'm not expert, I think the local jurisdiction level regulation, ADU regulation is will be playing a key role in terms of how effective the ADU will be actually working in local jurisdiction.
Great. All right, well, I think that captures all the questions we got from the audience, and I'm out of questions myself. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up. I want to thank Ethan and Matt and June for wonderful presentations, very interesting topics, very timely topics as well, especially as we come out of COVID. So, and thank you to all the participants as well. And I believe we have a little bit of a break before the next roundtable sessions start up. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.